In our study so far, Sri Aurobindo has described the complete realization of unity as the essence of the integral knowledge and of the integral yoga. And the scope of this unity is not limited to an experience or a realization in some deeper states of concentration and meditation, but must be actualized all the way into all the details of our life and activity, which he has described in 3 degrees of expression. In this larger scheme of the perception of unity in the cosmos, we saw the cosmos itself formed of 7 broad principles or planes, and in this perception we recognize that there are 2 distinct regions in the cosmos. There is a double nature to this manifestation. In the vocabulary of the Veda, the upper half and the lower half, parardha and aparardha. The Sanskrit vocabulary is very suggestive. Ardha is half, para is beyond or higher or transcending. So parardha is the transcendent half. And what's the other lower half? Because it does not have any existence in itself. It exists because that exists. So you cannot give it a name in itself. It can only be described in terms of the other. So, aparardha. The parardha displaced, the parardha fragmented, the parardha expressed in a different way. The always representing separation, displacement, some form of change or distortion. So in the very terminology, there is a suggestion that the divine reality, founding itself in a divine oneness, displaces itself or manifests in this lower half based on a loss of that oneness, at least in appearance. And so it is the lower half. And yet it represents that, is made of that. And therefore, when we look a little more deeply, everything here in the lower half corresponds to something in the upper half. And that correspondence is a secret link, pointing to the higher possibility that the upper half can now begin to express or work in the lower half and emerge from its hiding and reveal itself more and more. The beauty of this lower half, therefore, is that the hidden can reveal. That which is not seen, that which is invisible, that which appears impossible, can begin to actualize and become true. An evolution, an emergence of things which could not be, now coming forward. And all that's coming forward in the evolution is nothing but that which was in the upper half, here secretly hidden, now emerging. And so the nature of this lower half, we may refer to it as the lower nature or lower half, but in fact it is the most interesting of the two, because here you can have the experience of a series of miraculous emergences in that movement that we call evolution. So this being the backdrop of what was earlier studied, here Sri Aurobindo brings us to the recognition of this double nature. There is a higher nature of Satchidananda in which he is found, and the lower nature of mind, life and body in which he is veiled. And these two have to be, first of all, reconciled and then united in the overall experience of the oneness which has been worked upon in the discussion so far. How this is to be done is what is being described now. in what we are reading, we must keep in mind, Sri Aurobindo never sees things in isolation. His is a mind that sees continuity. Even when he describes one thing, he describes it in the context of the continuum that is this cosmos. So even as he describes what needs to be done here, it is not to be understood merely as part of a process where you have attained oneness and now you must do this. What must be done is valid even when we have not attained to that oneness as we are today. And so when we read this text, we have to view it in two perspectives. First, in its highest, is from the poise of one who has attained to the experience of the oneness within and is now articulating, organizing and expressing that oneness in life and working to reconcile and then unite these two halves of the cosmos. But at the same time, what he describes is something which we have to begin as we are. In our current consciousness, where at least we can glimpse that there is this oneness, where something within us is convinced not only of its existence, but also feels intuitively that this is the deeper truth of our being and this is our inevitable destiny. And with this, we begin to put into practice what he teaches from wherever we are. You will recall earlier in this book, he discusses the three outstanding characteristics of the integral yoga, which does not exist in any of the other systems of yoga. And one of the outstanding characteristics is that it begins where you are. It does not require from you any prior developed capacity or any prior tendency or temperament of your nature, since it deals with the whole of human nature and turns it towards a divinization. Whatever may be our condition, whatever our temperament and nature, we begin from where we are, and as we read, we take small steps in the direction that he articulates. So you will see even his formulations of what needs to be done can be seen as a continuum from where we are to higher consciousness in which one has attained to the oneness and is seeking to articulate and express it. In this, he has described that this double nature of this manifestation, we have to review and remold the lower in the light, force and joy of the higher. So first was reviewing how exactly does this relate to that, and how is this to be an expression of the light, force and joy of the Satchidananda. And in reviewing, gradually as our perspective shifts, there is a remolding also that takes place. And of the lower, we have seen the domain of matter, life and mind correspond to the Sat and the consciousness force, and the mind corresponding to the creative power of the Satchidananda, and the center within us of the psychic being, our soul, corresponding to the bliss aspect of the Satchidananda. How are these on the lower scale to be recognized in terms of the higher? As a first step, the big difference that we see between the lower and the higher is that the upper half is essentially one of infinity. It is not a divided consciousness, and therefore it is always in a continuum that is infinite. The lower half is fundamentally one of division, of pieces, of finitenesses. So our human life is defined by I am separate from everything else. The everything else is made up of so many pieces, so many separate flowers, so many leaves, so many humans, so many grains of sand. Everything is fragmented. And our mind, working through the senses, reaches out and perceives separation. In its understanding of things, it looks at the pieces of separation, tries to break them further to look at what's inside, and then tries to join them to understand how they all work together. But always working in pieces. Our emotions are also operating in relationships of pieces. I can only give so much of myself before I am overwhelmed because I cannot give more or I have lost myself. And you're always working within limitations in relationships, in feelings, in emotions, in affections. In our sensations, we are always overwhelmed when things are too much, or we find life insipid when things are too little. And so everything is seen in terms of pieces, limitations, and therefore dissatisfaction, incapacity, and inevitable failure. How this lower relates to the higher is what he describes, and we have seen half of the description so far as relates to matter and life. And today we will take up in depth the aspect of the emotions and mind. But quickly to reread and to summarize so that we get back into context, he says, we have to realize matter as a sense-created mold of the spirit, a vehicle for all manifestation of the light, force and joy of the Satchidananda in the highest conditions of terrestrial being and activity. All matter is meant to be a mold and vehicle. Created by what? By the senses. If materiality. It's our senses that distinguish between this and the other. This part is pink, that part is green, this must be flower, that must be leaf, and we separate. And therefore, appearance of some kind of a mold. And into that mold, the spirit can begin to fill and then take charge of the mold and use the mold as a vehicle for its deployment, for its revelation and expression. So the flower which you have before you was earlier just a bundle of molecules. As the spirit fills it, the molecules begin to give off a certain quality, a certain beauty of form, of fragrance, of presence. And when you look at the flower, you experience the joy. There is a touch of something of the Satchidananda that is able to articulate itself and glow out from the flower. And it is that which gives it value. And so for everything in life. Every form, every experience, every relationship, every action has value only in terms of how much of the Satchidananda it can begin to glow out. It has value for the future only in terms of how much it is capable of further developing to express the Satchidananda. To the extent that it can develop more, we see possibilities and we value it more. To the extent that it shuts down and cannot express more, it loses value and eventually breaks down as a mold, reforms. The same material is reformed to produce new molds, new flowers, new trees. Always a step further and a step further. So we begin to look at the domain of matter in this way. It's the vehicle for the expression of Satchidananda in finiteness, in forms, in appearances. That which is infinite can fill inside and glow and reveal itself. Next, he says, we have to see life as a channel for the infinite force, divine, and break the barrier of a sense-created and mind-created farness and division from it, so that that divine power may take possession of and direct and change all our life activities, until our vitality transfigured ceases in the end to be the limited life force which now supports mind and body, and becomes a figure of the all blissful conscious force of Satchidananda. So we have dwelt upon this in some depth last time. Our current life energy is limited. It supports mind and body with its limitation. Look at it practically. We have only so much energy to execute our day. At the end of the day, we are exhausted. We need to regenerate the energy through process of food and sleep. And then what little energy we have, we again pour out until we are exhausted and we have to regenerate. That energy not only is used in the action that we perform in the world, but it's also energy that is used to simply remain what we are. If you withdraw that energy from the body itself breaks down and decomposes within minutes. That the life force withdraws, the decomposition starts. So there's a huge energy which is being used, limited quantity, used just to sustain the life energy in the body. And then to sustain the life energy in the mind. Even when we are doing nothing and sitting idle externally, physically, our mind is active. And that is drawing energy. In fact, in the balance between the physical energy and the mental energy that is consumed, we find that the energy consumed by the mind is far greater. It's the reason why you will see as a general tendency in humanity, those who direct themselves much more in thought, in quest of pursuit of ideas, tend to have weaker bodies, because the mind sucks energy from the body and weakens its development. In the physical reality of the biological organization, the brain takes up almost a quarter of the energy which is produced through the food and digestion, and of the blood supply itself and its distribution of oxygen, the major part goes to sustaining the brain. We see a huge amount of energy consumed just to be doing nothing externally. And all that energy then directed to doing something in the world leads to very little in terms of outcome. One of the great frustrations of life is we cannot do what we want to do. And even when we move out to do things, we can only do so much because of lack of energy. Time is another constraint, but much bigger is the lack of energy. Well, if you take an example in history of one of the most prodigious geniuses of human history, Leonardo da Vinci, he produced such extraordinary work. He literally defined an age to come, set the type of the next several hundred years of the modern mind of humanity. And touching every field, he made breakthroughs and pushed forward what later formally had to be caught up and perfected by a scientific discovery and a process over several hundred years. And he achieved all this within a few decades. And if you observe his life, you notice one thing: he was always doing something. And he was doing it so rapidly, with so much energy and vitality. How did he have the time? And we discover in the literature that it is said he would sleep barely 1 hour in the day. And even that 1 hour was split over 4 sessions of 15 minutes each. So pretty much every 6 hours, he would go to sleep for 15 minutes, totally recharge and back to work. He would be working through the night. When he was working with the human body and understanding human biology, he would take cadavers, cut them open and do detailed, fine analysis. Now, it's not enough to have a mind that is curious. It's not enough to have skills that you're able to express, to do that work, even to observe and then to draw perfect drawings. You need that huge amount of energy to be doing all this with enthusiasm. We notice how our energies determine even our thoughts' directions. When the energy is low, your thoughts begin to be pessimistic, dull. Oh, I can't do it, this is too much, I'm tired, I'm fed up with life. And all this happens when the energy is dimmed. You revitalize the energy and suddenly, oh yeah, I want to do so much, and you're eager. Everything seems possible. And these fluctuations of energy within us determine the mold of the mind and even the capacity of the body. When our energies are low, a little bit of discomfort becomes painful and uncomfortable. When our energies physically are high, we can take in all the battering physically and still we feel enthusiastic. It does not hurt. We do not feel pain even. And this limited energy which is currently supporting mind and body has to not only grow but become a channel for that divine energy, for that blissful conscious force of Satchidananda. And so what we are seeing here in the relationship between the higher and the lower is that there is what we may call a super life. And here there is a limited, dimmed, gross appearance of animal life, basically, what has emerged from an animal evolution. Very incapable. And this represents that, or is meant to be linked to that, until that can begin to fill, amplify and transform it. So he describes that in 3 stages. The divine power may take possession of our life activities, then direct the life activities, and finally change the life activities. Until our vitality transfigured ceases in the end to be the limited life force which now supports mind and body. But still it must become something, a figure of the all-blissful conscious force of Satchidananda. When that force pours through, it is not only a force of action, of life, it is an all-blissful force. It brings in the life itself that character of the bliss of the Satchidananda in its flow. And so he has described this life as a channel for the infinite force divine. What separates these two? We saw last time the sense-created and mind-created farness and division, which is the barrier. You recall in the physical domain, it was the sense-created mold of spirit. It is senses which create this appearance of physical form and separation. And the same with the life energy, it is the senses and the mind which create the sense of farness, the sense of division. Where is that energy? I feel I have only as much energy as my body currently contains. I wake up from sleep, I am tired. How am I going to manage the day? But this is all the energy I have. Now I must mete out in small bits so that I can survive till the end of the day, or regenerate in the middle by taking a nap. But in fact, even physically, we are surrounded by this humongous energy, infinite energy. Spiritually, all that energy is here. What is creating the separation is this form that limits, with which I have identified myself through my senses and my mind. As I train myself to begin to view the whole universe not as other, but as continuum, as extension of my own awareness, or rather my awareness as a part of the infinite awareness, one discovers slowly, bit by bit, the energy also within me and outside me forms a continuum. And I'm able to draw from that infinite energy and exercise it in life. When taking the example of Leonardo da Vinci, when he slept in quotes, for 15 minutes, obviously it was not a normal sleep. It was a special kind of a concentrated sleep. What kind was it? And we get a hint from the mother's letter to her son André. She is writing this, I believe, in 1934 or 35. And in the letter she mentions, for the last 15 years I have not had sleep in the normal sense of the word. Now 15 years, that's since 1920 when she came back from Japan. And she explains that she takes a break of 15 minutes in which she goes into a deep trance, withdrawing from the body and going step by step all the way to touch the Satchidananda, regenerating from its contact and then coming back to return, fully regenerated, refreshed from a complete night's sleep in 15 minutes. And she did it sitting down. She didn't have a bed to lie down. 15 years, that's a long time. Only much later, when the biology began to give some trouble, that she began to use formally what was a bed, and even that was never fully flat. It was more like a couch that she was leaning against. Even in late years, when physically she was over 90, there would be nights in which the work would go on so far that she would say, it's 4 o'clock, the day has started, let's continue. No sleep at all physically. But the ability to be able to regenerate like this, she explains in one of her lectures, that in fact, what happens at night when we go to sleep is that we go through, a part of our consciousness goes through many layers. We are not one monotone. We are not this little piece of awareness that we are conscious of. That is only the most superficial layer. Behind are many layers which are of the same consciousness. They are not unconscious. They are equally conscious, but they are differently conscious and separated by a veil. And a part of us actually explores and enters those layers. When we have what we call a lucid dream, where in the dream state you are conscious that you are dreaming, it is a different grade of consciousness, but it is conscious and it is self-conscious. And it's one of those layers within, in between our gaps. But a part of us drifts through these layers and then goes deeper and higher until eventually, passing through many layers, it briefly touches the Satchidananda. And she says that point of contact may be a few seconds, but it is that which gives to the night sleep the freshness and regeneration. If those seconds are interrupted or prevented from happening, you might have gone deep and come back, but you will not have the freshness which normally we would expect to have. So the secret, she says, is to be able to go all the way to make that point of contact, even for a few seconds, and then we return. And she says the whole regeneration of the night's sleep is because of those few seconds. All the rest of the 7 hours or so that we have are the time needed to go within, make that contact, and the time needed to come out. Now this is because our sleep is primarily an unconscious process. Somehow nature has developed this process through the species in evolution, and we have this thing happening to us that we get sleepy, we get knocked out, something happens, we come out and we are fresh. But when we can make this process conscious, then it is possible to actually make that transition all the way to the Satchidananda and return consciously, and therefore more rapidly, and as the mother did, in 15 minutes. How Leonardo da Vinci developed this capacity, where he learnt it, or whether it was inborn or from some divine awakening, intuitive, we do not know, but he had obviously that capacity, otherwise he couldn't do what he did. Some people who have a regular practice of certain yogic processes, pranayam, asanas, meditation, whatever form it may be, develop a partial awakening of this inner range. and are therefore able to make that contact more rapidly, and the duration of sleep is naturally shortened. They're able to come out fully fresh. But otherwise one needs to develop this capacity yogically. But if you think about it now in the context of what we are reading, you need to go make a contact, and what do? You bring back something of that touch, which is what makes for the freshness and regeneration of the body and mind. If now that thing began to flow through, let's say first as a thin stream, and was able to continuously fill your mind and body and life, what would be the practical result? You would have that freshness and regeneration as a constant state, isn't it? And this is what he's saying here when he says, we have to see life as a channel for the infinite force divine and break the barrier of a sense-created and mind-created farness and division from it. Now, sense-created and mind-created division is what is keeping this separation. When this division or this barrier is gradually removed, then something of that can begin to gradually connect and stream through. And the result is that that divine power may take possession of and direct and change all our life activities until they are transfigured in terms of that, and become a figure of the all-blissful conscious force of Satchidananda. Now, what the reason for taking all this detail in the description is to point out that what we are seeking to attain is not a haphazard, abstract, distant reality. It is what is happening to us every night when a part of us goes in, makes that link and comes out. And if this is happening unconsciously, as we grow in consciousness, as we develop this link consciously, simply by sustained aspiration we can begin that process as we are today, tonight. As we begin to work upon it, something of that can begin to stream through, and a touch, maybe a series of reflections to begin with. It's not even a direct contact, but a series of reflections even would be enough to change completely the quality of our life. And this can begin with a conscious aspiration. Mother has spoken extensively about how this is to be done, and it's worth reviewing that, but from this context. And now we come to the next level of change. We've seen matter, how it has to be reviewed and how that will lead to a change. Life, how that is to be reviewed and a change. And now we come to mind. But mind, he takes up in two separate sections. Rereading those lines, we have similarly to change our sensational and emotional mentality into a play of the divine love and universal delight. And we have to surcharge the intellect which seeks to know and will in us with the light of the divine knowledge will, until it is transformed into a figure of that higher and sublime activity. Two separate sections. In the first one, he is describing sensational and emotional mentality. And the second one, he is describing the intellect which seeks to know and will. Why this distinction? In the nature of the evolution, the physical evolution provides only a limited range of capacity. When we look at matter and the extreme diversity of matter, it still boils down to a limited extension of types of matter, elements we may say, and their combinations. When we move from matter into life in evolution, life has far greater plasticity and therefore far greater possibilities of expression. But when we come into the domain of mind, potentially the mind is capable of exploring infinity. Although it acts as an instrument of finite pieces, it can go on to an infinity of finite pieces. It can explore all possibilities of thought, always stuck with a piece at a time, but still, it is the one instrument in our whole nature, in our being, which is capable of exploring infinity. And so necessarily here, evolution spreads out much more, develops here distinct types. And in particular, something which Sri Aurobindo describes early on in this book, nature creates or organizes within us 3 types of humanity. They represent successive stages in some sense, but they also represent 3 different directions of development. One type of humanity is a mind turned primarily to the senses and to a material expression. Physical man, Sri Aurobindo calls it. The second turns primarily to an emotional expression, but it is still mind working through energy and life relations. So the emotional mentality is what leads to the vital or emotional life. And then there is the part of the mind which stands back in its own as a means, as a tool of knowledge, seeking to know and to will, and that becomes the mental man proper. Now in humanity, Sri Aurobindo points out all 3 types of human beings exist, and that they are kept 3 distinct in some sense because they represent 3 different possibilities of organization and expression. We may even distinguish between the 3 to such a degree that they sometimes appear to be 3 different species of humanity. Biologically we are compatible, but psychologically we are so distinct that sometimes we have trouble understanding each other or seeing eye to eye. The values of physical man are so different from the values of the emotional man or the mental man. Of course, the most developed is one who has developed all 3 powers and is able to live across all 3 domains, but in continuity without experiencing conflict. This is the backdrop behind which we observe this distinction Sri Aurobindo makes. In us, the mind takes 3 statuses. One which is through the senses, one which is through the emotions, and one which is in knowledge. And therefore the transformation of the mind is a triple transformation within the mind itself. And he deals with the first 2 in one section. Change our sensational and emotional mentality into a play of the divine love and universal delight. The play is the character of the emotional nature. But always it is mind which is turning to senses, mind which is turning to emotions. But the common feature in both is the play. In this, it takes 2 forms. In the senses, what is it that the senses appreciate? When the senses themselves are formed when mind turns to body and through the body tries to know and will. The senses represent an action of the mind working inside the biology, embedding itself and trying to know through physical substance. As it struggles to know through substance, it organizes tools by which it can know more and more clearly. So at first, taking the example of a more rudimentary life form, let's say a bacterium, the bacterium does not have organized organs of sight, speech, taste, hearing, smell, touch. Its touch is rudimentary. Its touch develops gradually variations. It can feel in its touch vibration, which is our equivalent of hearing. It can feel in its touch an absorption as the bacterium wall touches another object, it absorbs material from it. It loses material into it through a certain ionic or molecular exchange. This exchange becomes the basis of taste, smell, and touch. And sight is its response to the play of light. Now you will be surprised to know bacteria also respond to light. They can synthesize light also in a very crude way. Chlorophyll in plants is only a highly refined expression of that basic capacity. Even our human skin is able to synthesize light, as you know. But that becomes more complex in the worm. In the bacterium, similarly, you have the ability of the bacterium to put out an extension of itself. Let's say it senses through this touch, equivalent of smell, that there is something here which is interesting. It can put out an appendage of itself that reaches out and connects to another bacterium, and therefore forming communities and communicating through those connections electrically. Now all of this is something which we can observe. A cluster of bacteria has this complex interconnection with electrical signals, chemical signals, ionic signals, and the whole behaves almost like a body, like a brain. Interesting suggestion that not only there's an individual consciousness, there's a group consciousness and a complex exchange taking place, which is all sensory. Mind in the senses and working, struggling to communicate, to know and to will. Now this power grows and develops sophisticated tools and instruments which become our formal organs of the senses. In principle though, that initial capacity to sense through the same point of contact continues in all our organs. So our skin today, for example, although it is primarily specialized as an organ of touch, it can also hear. When the vibrations are sufficiently intense, your feet or your hands can actually hear sound. And similarly, exposed to light, they can see. We are not speaking here of parapsychological phenomena, but purely physical phenomena. This possibility can grow further, and you can even train your fingertips, which are the most sensitive part of your hands, to sense the surface of an object, not only in terms of its surface smoothness, but also in terms of color. Now, these are experiments done in a laboratory where you can show that anybody can be made sufficiently sensitive through a training program to distinguish between two colors, just placing your finger on it. Changing the light that shines on the finger, you can feel the shift in color. Effectively seeing, but in a crude way, what the eye does in a sophisticated way, and so on for everything else. Now all of this is nothing but mind embedded inside biology, still seeking to know and to will. So the sensation essentially is power of mind working for what? What is the whole activity here, seeking to know and will, but the character it has in the activity of knowledge and will is enjoyment. It enjoys through the senses. So most obviously, this is a beautiful perfume, that is not so nice, this tastes so good. And all the sensations primarily are our means for enjoyment. And what is the form that this takes within us? Attraction and repulsion in the emotions or in the energies. This I enjoy and the worm starts moving towards it. This I find repellent and the worm starts moving away from it. The same instinct in us, much more sophisticated. This tastes good, I eat more. This doesn't taste good, I reject. This person makes me feel good, I am attracted. This person does not make me feel good, I am repelled, etc. What's the nature of the underlying truth in the upper half, in the divine half of reality? The divine has neither attraction nor repulsion. It views all experiences as play of delight. Everything is delight and colors of delight. And so when that begins to act here in our sensational mentality, it experiences delight in all the shades of the senses. Neither attraction nor repulsion, neither liking nor disliking, here's a different experience, and here's a different experience, and so on. You may still consider certain experiences to be more refined, more elevating, but in the divine working, you would not experience that repulsion that we would normally associate with unpleasant experiences. You would still see it as a color of delight. I remember seeing once a movie which was, they spent a lot of money, it was a big budget movie. It failed in the box office. And there were reviews which went in extremes. People said, oh, it's boring, it's useless, it's bad. And then there were those who said it's a masterpiece. If you went into the actual experience of the movie, the person had crafted skillfully an experience which was almost detestable. You see how it works? Skillfully crafted in tiniest detail an experience which is not at all comfortable, but it's been built up as a world in which you can enter and experience. This is how it is, this is how it can be. And then you withdraw from it and maybe you go to better worlds. But the way it was built up was a masterpiece. And there are many such movies which have been built up particularly to put forward a domain of life, a mood, an experience, a way of being, and skillfully, perfectly made like a masterpiece. Just because you don't like it doesn't mean it's not a masterpiece. And so there's a certain aspect of the divine experience, because everything is aspect of the divine to it. It's just another shade, another color, not so nice perhaps, but interesting experience. So the whole turn of the sensational mentality is towards delight in all things. Therefore, universal delight. We have similarly to change our sensational mentality into a play of universal delight. And the other thing is the emotional mentality. When the mind now has grown beyond the worm into the animal nature, the same mind is reaching out through a play of energies. We notice that in the early exchanges of the bacteria, there was an exchange which was primarily of energy, physical, electrical, ionic and chemical. But as the evolution proceeds, the essential character of life energy comes forward more and more directly. And we have emotional connections. A mother, when she gives birth to a child, has an umbilical connection which is physical. But the moment it is cut, the energetic connection continues even after this is cut. And that energetic connection is so strong, she feels herself in the child. She feels what the child feels in herself because of that extreme identification. And over time, gradually nature weakens the bond, but it never really goes away. I have an extraordinary example to share. Of course, most of you have your own stories. We had the example, Panditji's sister, when she was about approaching 90, in her late 80s. She was ill at that point, and she was almost bedridden, not entirely at that point, but almost bedridden, and we had to take good care of her. Her daughter was in Bombay, and we got the message that she was ill. And then one day, Panditji's sister in her late 80s, early 90s, she said, I'm feeling very strange, my body is feeling strange, I feel as if my body is going to die. She was okay in every other way physically, just this sensation, this emotional feel. And then we got a message that her daughter had passed away. Of course, we didn't tell her, but the connection which was there was, although she had very little contact, they perhaps spoke once in a year or so perhaps. Emotionally, she had even forgotten that whole world. But the link which was there still continued on some level, and that umbilical is there. We have not just that form, I'm taking this because it's an extreme example when you give birth, but that those forms of umbilicals are constantly created between human beings through friendships, through affections, both positive and negative. When you dislike somebody and you persistently experience the dislike, you are equally forming an umbilical of a negative vibration, as when you persistently express affection of liking to somebody, where you form a positive umbilical. Hate as much forms an umbilical as love. But this is the nature of human exchange. We are always exchanging energies. Being in a collective space, that energy exchange takes on certain automatic forms that we are utterly unconscious of, and that's what creates what we describe as crowd psychology, where a whole group can behave together as if one, and do sometimes an individual may do things which they would never do in isolation, but they get sucked into the group energy and they lose their independent identity. How much of our behavior is determined by the energies that flow through us is visible in such group behavior. You come out and you wonder what happened and you regret sometimes. But while being in it, the exchange of energy leaves a thread of the umbilical even after you come out. And depending on the degree of that identification or the frequency of it, that thread may take time to fade out or break. Sometimes it can last for several days. If you're frequently a participant of that group, if you have psychologically aligned yourself to that group, then the thread may stay with you even though you have no physical contact with the group. This is often what happens in certain cults and certain group identities which are built with that intention. So you will find people have strong attachments to the school where they grew up, and they belong to an alumni which still feels a strong bond. It was cultivated and it has not been removed. And there are sometimes clear methodologies used, particularly in business spaces, to create group bonds. They will call team building, or in the military, where also you want to create similar bonds. And the bonds have to go so deep that the unit, and that's the word used, a unit, which is one person literally consisting of many people, the unit must work as a single person. And where necessary, an individual in the unit would happily give up their life to survive, to protect the unit, which is the larger superego of this individual ego. And all of this is cultivated through these emotional bonds. Now I'm describing this because the nature of these emotional connections is so wide, so varied, and so complex. Just because we do not see it physically doesn't mean it's not there. Sometimes those who are clairvoyant will look at a person and say, I see from you 3 or 4 cords going out. They can even count in number the number of deep attachments that you have. Sometimes it corresponds to siblings, children, parents, or some strong personal affections. And one can see them literally as cords linking. If you look at the whole of humanity from this perspective, it's a complex web of energy flows. Most of it unaware to the surface mind. What is the truth of that, of this emotional mentality and all the variations of emotions that play out through this web? We speak of categories of emotions. In the Indian science of theatre, they describe 9 categories of emotions, Nava Rasa. The word used, rasa, is suggestive. Rasa literally means juice or sap. And the suggestion behind it is that whatever the particular form of the emotion, there is an essential quality of the sap, of the juice, which we enjoy, even if the form of emotion is not particularly enjoyable. So the 9 would include not only love, but also fear, surprise, disgust, and so on. Now, in the nature of disgust, let's take the nature of fear. You would wonder, well, what is positive about it? If you watch little children, often they will want to hear a scary story. So when I was teaching children at the age of 10 and 11, one of the things that they would often ask, today is someone's birthday, can we have a story? Okay? What kind of story? Ghost story. And the moment someone would say ghost story, everybody would say, ooh, and they would rush and close the windows and doors to darken the room so that they could experience the fear, tension, anticipation of the ghost story. Now you see how they are excited, and then they are excited about experiencing fear. And so there's something behind all these forms of emotions, which is the common juice, the sap, the rasa of delight. Now we are not directly experiencing delight, or at least we are not conscious of that aspect of delight. But it's there, and because it is there, the emotion becomes interesting. You want to be surprised. If you watched a movie which is a monotone of one emotion, it's not interesting. And so the science of theatre in India teaches that an experience is complete only when you have covered the full spectrum of the 9 emotions. And so you plan for it. And you'll observe the most interesting movies have all these elements organized. The forms vary, the degree, the relationships vary, but you have to have a touch of these, otherwise somehow life is not complete. Now who in us is really enjoying that? Obviously when the child is excited about a scary story, there is an emotional enjoyment. But deeper behind that, the one who takes the pure sap of delight is the inmost soul, the psychic being, for whom every experience of life is a means of nourishment and growth. Obviously, those experiences which help it to grow, which lift the consciousness, which turn it towards truth and beauty and the sacred, those are more directly nutritious to it, nourishing. Those which turn away are not helpful to its growth, and yet it is, that's interesting, this also is possible, that's a new experience. It draws from that also. Often for the surface emotions, we need the contrast of the dark emotions against the bright emotions. If you're happy and happy and happy and happy, eventually you get bored. So you have to contrast it with a little bit of unhappiness, a little bit of distress or something. And if you don't have a reason to be unhappy, you will very quickly manufacture a reason. Oh, nowadays the food is not as tasty as it used to be, and you can make a big scene about it and overwhelm yourself with the problem which didn't exist. And people find all kinds of reasons to. In human relations often it takes this form that if you get bored, you're married, you've been with each other 24 hours, days, months, years, it's kind of boring after a while. So you have to spice it up with excuses for conflict, for experiencing variations of emotions. And you see often in many couples, especially where the basis is much more emotional than of a deeper truth, they need the spice of emotions. They will create problems, they will create conflicts, they will create fights just to feel that there's some engagement and exchange of emotions. And others may not understand why, but if you remove that, suddenly everything is insipid, pointless. So it all depends on which level you live, and on that level you find your kind of excitement, so to say, which makes the emotional connection worthwhile. But all this is the lower play, in division, where the divinity is hidden, veiled. What is its relation to the higher? What of the Satchidananda is working through this secretly? What of the Satchidananda must emerge to be revealed? And he says the common sap of the delight is the flow of the divine love. After all, if you look from the higher perspective, everything in the universe being an expression of the same one divinity. What is its relation to itself? Because there is no other. What is your relationship to your own consciousness? Obviously, identity, oneness. But when you project yourself out of yourself, what's the relationship of oneness? How does oneness express in otherness? Love, intimacy, closeness. And all relation eventually, all exchange of energy eventually is a representation of that love, colors of that love, and the delight of the play of love. In the human being, because of the particular separation and division of egos, the love gets warped. First, it acquires a sense of possession. This, because I love this, is mine. With the sense of possession comes fear. If I lose it, I will be unhappy. With the sense of fear comes an insecurity. Will it work? Will it fall? I must pay insurance to protect myself from it being damaged or stolen, and so on. All these begin to create a cloud of distortions around. When you remove that separation, when you actually experience everything as yourself, and all the insecurities and their related egocentric distortions fade away, you have only, another form of myself. Delight of discovery and the embracement of love. In the form in which it expresses in children, before the mind is too rigidly formed, before the emotions acquire distortions, little children, you will see, they enjoy two kinds of games. One, you throw the ball, bounce, catch, throw, bounce, catch. Pure exchange. You throw, take, give, take. Just the exchange and the joy of that exchange. And the second variation which you will find, the baby, cover, delight, laugh. You cover yourself and suddenly you're gone, and now you're back. And for a little baby, it's such a delight. And as an adult, you might wonder, what's the big deal? Just having my hand covers my face. No, for the child, it's the memory of that relationship of the divine veiling itself from itself, hiding and revealing, and hiding and revealing. That's the play for which the universe was born, and into this universe you have entered to experience this pushed to the extreme. And in that extreme, I look at the world and I say, what a terrible world. Where is divinity? There is only suffering and unhappiness and all the darkness. That's the complete veiling. And to recover from that veiling is the extreme of the play of delight. But you see this at the most early stage of our human life, when the psychic influence is perhaps most directly visible. These are the kinds of play. And so Sri Aurobindo now captures this whole thing of the nature of the emotional relations, the emotional mentality. We have similarly to change our emotional mentality into a play of divine love and equally extending into the universal delight. So he has put both together, the sensational mind and emotional mind together, because these two have something which is very similar. In both there is the play. In both the play is through the senses, and through the senses the aspect of the emotions. You cannot separate the two. One leads to the other inevitably. And so he combines them. We have similarly to change our sensational and emotional mentality into a play of the divine love and universal delight. The love and the delight are the nature of the Satchidananda as it begins to reveal in the world through form, through the sensory and emotional mentality. All of us are intended to become vehicles for the revealed expression of this play of divine love and universal delight. And what remains now in our mentality, which is not obviously part of this, is the pure impulse of knowledge and will. We saw how both through the sensations and through the emotions, it was still the mind's impulse of knowledge wanting to know, wanting to reach out and reconnect. That was working. But it was working through their character of senses and emotions. But the pure impulse of knowledge and will remains, and that its primary organ, its primary vehicle is the intellect. And now what happens to this part of the mind? And he says, and we have to surcharge the intellect which seeks to know and will in us with the light of the divine knowledge will. K capital W capital, knowledge will. So surcharge it until it is transformed into a figure of that higher and sublime activity. So now the link Sri Aurobindo is creating is the power of the intellect in the mind with the knowledge will of the Satchidananda. The impulse to knowledge and the impulse to will is rooted in the intellect. Now, how do we distinguish the intellect from the sensational and emotional mentality? We notice it is the part of our mentality which is able to stand back and know itself and observe itself. The sensational mentality is reaching out to know the other. The emotional mentality is reaching out to connect with the other. But the intellect is the part, even as it wants to know everything else, is first observant of its own knowledge, of its own separate awareness. I know that I don't know. I know that I want to know. And now I know that I am close to knowing it, and I know that I know it. But all the time it is this innate knowing which distinguishes it from the other two. That is mind working in itself for itself. And this power of the intellect is its primary faculty through which it knows and wills. Now both of these are separate operations in the intellect. I can know that this flower is beautiful, and I can choose to place it in an appropriate location. The knowledge may cause you to want to will it. The will itself rarely operates without some knowing about what it is you are willing. So in the domain of the intellect, very clearly knowledge leads will. We have a different kind of knowledge will which is taking place in the instinct, in the life energies, in the physical senses, which is the inferior part of the mind buried in there, where the will leads the knowledge, where I feel uncomfortable, I think I need to do this. I don't know why, but I'm feeling uncomfortable. I am feeling hungry, but I don't know what it is I should eat. I just need to put something in my stomach. I'm feeling like I might get sick, but I feel that if I eat now, I could avoid that sickness. If I eat this, then I can get free of the sickness. The instinctive impulse is there, the knowledge follows after. The cat, when it is sick, goes and chews on a particular grass which makes it vomit, and then it's free. But it goes to the grass only when it is sick and it needs to vomit. But it is not conscious that this grass has the power to cure me through this process. It just feels an impulse, a craving for that grass. So you see, the will and knowledge are split, with the will dominating the knowledge buried in the inferior gut feel, low level of the reflection of intuition, we may say, in the gut feel, instinct. But in the mind, they have come into their own as separate powers, and the two quite independent. And if you go one more step in the higher ranges of mind, in the intuitive consciousness, the knowledge leads the will, and the two are joined again. It's very interesting. Above and below, knowledge and will are closely tied. Below, the will leads knowledge, above, the knowledge leads will. In between is the intellect, bridging these two, where knowledge and will are separate powers. Each can act independent of the other. The problem is then, I know what I should do, but my will does not collaborate. And sometimes my desires lead and my knowledge says, that's not the best thing, but they're split, they're divided. So this, in the intellect, the knowledge and will are the two impulses. But in that higher, the knowledge will, all the way into the Satchidananda, the knowledge will are one. You can view them or experience them as separate aspects, but of a single power. That's why he puts knowledge hyphen will, with the K capital and W capital. The Chit Shakti, conscious force of the Satchidananda, its aspect of consciousness becomes in us knowledge, its aspect of force becomes in us the will. But there, it is a consciousness that wills in the very awareness. It is not a separate process. And therefore, what it wills is what it knows, or rather, what it knows is what it wills, and there is no division. Its action is perfect. Within us, because the knowledge and the will are separate faculties, I have to constantly align them. I know I have to do this, but when I start doing, I am activating a different faculty which doesn't quite align perfectly with what I know, and I must look back and forth and constantly align the will to the knowledge. For example, you can be taught to get the perfect balance on the bicycle. Recall, all of us have been through that experience of learning to get the cycle's balance. Before doing it, you see people cycling and you say, wow, what an extraordinary skill. They are constantly moving the handle to get it perfectly in balance. Must require extraordinary intelligence or skill. In fact, when we have to teach robots to do it, it's very difficult. Now, of course, with higher computation, we can do it more easily, but still, there's a learning process. I recall when we were children, there was a lecture given by some of the older students. They called it the cyclist and unconscious physicist, because there's so much physics happening in just keeping your bicycle in balance. And you look at someone and say, wow, what a skill. Now, when you actually get on the bicycle, you notice something happening. You have been told you should do this. As your hand moves, you're tracking. Your mind is telling, no, do this, no, do that. And the two are different operations. And at some point, you learn to trust. And you begin to let go. You stop trying to force the two together and allow the instinct to fill and lead. And suddenly you find now the balance is automatic. And initially when you have just got the balance, you're doing it, and then you start observing what are you doing, and pluck, the balance is broken. Because in the act of saying, what am I doing, your knowledge and will split again. You join them again in the instinct, but in between was a transition. You started with a knowledge and a will separated. You aligned them until you embedded in the instinct a new habit. You taught your instinct a new way of doing something which was not part of our evolution. Nowhere in animal evolution or human evolution have we acquired the skill of the balancing of a bicycle. And yet we were able to embed that skill at an instinctive level by a conscious process of knowledge will working to harmonize. So this is a fascinating exploration of how our intellect works and how it can, its limitation because of this division, but also how it can learn to harmonize the two and teach even the instinct or access the higher intuition. When you begin to experience the alignment of the knowledge and will, you experience a flow. It happens automatically. What you know is what you become. And it is here that the intellect begins to identify with and become a vehicle for intuition. In all pure intuitive action through the intellect, what you know is the impulse that becomes. You can train yourself to align these two, to join the knowledge will until they become perfectly attuned and an expression of the intuition. The moment they split, you fall into the rational, intellectual process, which is fragmented essentially, which is essentially ignorant and will fail. When you realign the two, you align yourself to this higher faculty of intuition, and it happens perfectly, flawlessly. Now you will notice, in all perfect action, these two are aligned. In all imperfect action, these two are separate. And the future development of the power of intellect is in the alignment of these two. Now take a very physical example of a gymnast. Extending the whole experience of the cyclist. When a gymnast does a perfect somersault, the precision and timing has to be so perfect, you cannot think it out. You cannot say, okay, now I am at 45 degrees and I should extend my leg by a quarter of a centimeter. You cannot. It's done so fast and it has to be so smooth and fluid that you have to trust an instinct. Except that you're making the body do something which is contrary to its instinct. And so an intuition fills in and awakes in the body a power or an action similar to the instinct, except it's coming from an enlightened consciousness and makes it do it perfectly. And this is true of all physical skills, including singing, including writing, including anything. And just as this could come into you, by a process of training you can make it happen more, it can also be received without formal training, by a direct flow, like an inspired poem. When the poem flows in you, you write it out with no training, and the words, the rhythms, the rhymes, everything comes into place. And you look at it and say, wow, did I just write that? And if any time halfway through the poem you start thinking, what am I writing? It breaks the flow and you lost it. Now, if this can happen in writing a poem, it can happen in any activity of the body, and in gymnastics, in any skill, one can receive it. So I'll come back to a few favorite examples which I have used before, but they're necessary to understand the place of the intellect. You remember, I've mentioned it here, when the head of our physical education department was selected by the mother to be her partner in playing tennis. And she said to him, tomorrow you'll play tennis with me. And he said, Mother, I've never played tennis. She said, don't worry, I will give you the capacity. So he said, what is this, give you the capacity? So he went the next day, went to his department, pulled up a book of tennis and started reading the rules, saw pictures, this is called backhand, this is called forehand, and this is how you throw the ball, this is how you align it. Okay, he goes and takes the racket, and as he begins to play, spontaneously he is flowing. In modern vocabulary we will say he is in the flow, but he is flowing. And after the game, people asked him, you must be playing for a long time. You are playing like a champ. He said, no, it's the first game I played in my life. Now, if this is possible with a skill like this, a complex skill, it's possible with anything. Literally, if you've seen the movie The Matrix, they have the scene where somebody says, I need to fly a helicopter, download the skill. And so the computer downloads the skill of flying a helicopter, he gets into it and flies. Now literally this is possible for us because all skill is a bundle of knowledge will in consciousness. What is knowledge will? Complete knowledge of the thing, the experience, and the spontaneous imprint of how to respond in that experience to those movements. That's all there is to it. And it's all quality of consciousness. Chit Shakti, knowledge will, knowledge power of consciousness. And if you have developed it in you, that particular bundle of knowledge will that you have organized in your consciousness can be transmitted or imprinted into another person. Now I gave the example also of singing. A person who has not had any particular training of music can be similarly imprinted the gift of the music. And spontaneously the voice will flow along certain lines and certain harmonies effortlessly. Any skill, any instrument. The mother refers to this in a different vocabulary when she speaks of the hands of Mozart, I believe, right? Mozart, yes. No, the piano, I think it was Mozart. She says the hands were so developed because of the consciousness imprinted in them that they acquired an independent character of themselves in the consciousness. And she said they remain still in the universal consciousness, available to you. So if you want to play the piano, instead of retraining your hands from scratch, you can tune into that bundle of hand imprint and knowledge will of the hand consciousness, invoke that and let it play. And you'll find your hands moving spontaneously in the right way. To the extent that something of your conscious knowledge separates from the will and thinks, am I doing right? And starts observing itself, it breaks out, you'll fumble. To the extent that you remove yourself and let it lead and the knowledge will join, they flow. So coming to this intellect which seeks to know and will separately in us, we have to surcharge the intellect with the light of the divine knowledge will. Now what's the ultimate of knowledge will? The knowledge will which is all knowledge will. The divine Sachidananda's knowledge will, which includes all knowledge will of the whole cosmos, isn't it? When you surcharge your intellect with that, the light of the divine knowledge will, and surcharge. Charging is one thing, surcharging is another thing. Each word of Sri Aurobindo is suggestive. When you charge it, well, you've filled it as much as it can take. It stops with that. When you surcharge, you put excess. Meaning, when that fills, that knowledge will, the light of that knowledge will fills your mind, there's so much that it can take as it is currently, because remember, it's a finite instrument. You could stop there and say that's all, and you'd remain in an amplified, limited capacity. But when you're surcharged, then the excess that pours in stretches the mind, enlarges, expands, pushes its limits, widens its capacities. And this must be done, because remember, the mind must eventually open out to embrace the infinite in whatever way it can, to whatever extent it can, not remain stuck in a little piece. So all this widening, expanding is a process by which the mind becomes larger, freer, clearer, and its working, its powers begin similarly to widen and expand. It is meant to be a vehicle for the divine knowledge, and the divine knowledge is infinite. So the more it can approach infinity, the more close it can be as a effective or perfect instrument for that. So we have to surcharge the intellect. You see, that one word points to something so important. With the light of the divine knowledge will. Why light? You can say force. But in fact, the experience is that when things become aware in us, we have the sense of it clear, seeing, lit up. And in fact, this is the nature of the experience of the supramental consciousness, or as you grow towards it, there is the sense of increasing light, illumination of pure awareness, which is knowledge, which is will, which is delight. And so when the surcharging process continues, what happens? Until it, the intellect, is transformed into a figure of that higher and sublime activity. So the higher activity, sublime. Why does he use this word sublime? It's not enough to say higher. Because in fact, the higher you go up in the character of knowledge, the more refined the grade of consciousness. Compared to it, the lower grades feel dull and coarse. Now what is this experience? You see, the knowledge can rest and operate in different densities or grades of substance, of consciousness. So observe in yourself, when you are thinking, if you have had a heavy meal you'll find your thoughts are a little slow, sluggish. If you are in an environment which is very clear, pure, refined, your thoughts are also more clear, pure and refined. The substance in which the thought operates or the mind operates, the more refined it can get, the more plastic, the more free the working of knowledge. The more the substance is rigid, the more the knowledge and the access to knowledge and the pure working of the will be dulled or become sticky. So you have to find the appropriate experience you have had when you're writing this poem and there is the free flow of an inspiration. When it's a bit sluggish, I know there is this word I should express, I can feel its rhythm, I know its meaning, but the word does not come to my mind. Something is blocked, something is sticky. And I can even feel or hear the rhythm of the word, but the word is gone. Or I get the word, but I'm not sure of its meaning. Or I get the rhythm, but I'm not sure of the idea behind. Something is missing, some element in the movement is not free-flowing, it's not fluid enough because there's a rigidity, there's a stickiness. So as we grow higher in quality of consciousness, there is increasingly this fluidity until in the highest, it can have the fluidity of thin, fine gas, and yet the force and intensity of something stiff and rigid. So the mother describes this experience when she is narrating in her agenda the experience of the supramental consciousness and the way the mind sees it. She says, when the mind looks at it, it takes the form of a cube and of a gas so fine that it is utterly fluid but so hard as if diamond hard. You see these two characteristics, the aspect of knowledge being completely fluid and free, and the aspect of will or force being irresistible in its push, which you experience as diamond hardness and yet fluidity of gas. Interesting feel. But this is the nature as the higher faculties open out and the consciousness or the knowledge grows. And so he says, the intellect is transformed into a figure of that higher and sublime activity of the knowledge will of the Satchidananda. A figure of, but eventually a complete transformation and a vehicle also of. And the activity he does not define. Now all of this is a plug. It's an indication pointing to a much more detailed discussion of this transformation which takes place in the much later chapters in the Yoga of Self-Perfection, when it discusses the ascent of the mind through the gradations of the intuition and the supramental thought and the supramental knowledge and will. But he points there. And each of these things he points to until it comes to this, until it comes to this. So matter as a vehicle until it comes to this. Life as a channel until it comes to this. Sensational and emotional mind towards this. And intellect until it comes to this. Everything is until. And in that whole upward movement, you can have any number of degrees, any number of graded stages, no problem. You begin where you are now, today. And simply take one little step in each of these facets or aspects of your life. But that last part, where until it becomes a vehicle for the pure action of the Satchidananda, requires some fundamental change. Because the vehicle used currently, the substance used currently for our living is still a little crude. The substance itself must undergo a fundamental change, which also will be done by that continuous process of action from above. But this nature of this change is important, and until this happens, the final perfection will not be complete. And so this particular aspect of the requirement for the perfection he takes up next. He says, this transformation cannot be complete or really executed without the awakening of the truth mind, which corresponds in the mental being to the supermind and is capable of receiving mentally its illuminations. So we will pause with this for today and take up the full elaboration of this idea next time. But what this means is, within our mind there is a particular faculty which he has called the truth mind. And that corresponds in the mental being to the supermind. This is a very important idea. Recall a few chapters before, when there was this discussion, how can we enter the higher ranges of the divine consciousness without losing the full awareness here? Because we want to express that here. And then he points to the fact that in the higher layers of our own mind, there are gradations which correspond to those of the supermind and the Satchidananda. And through those higher gradations, the higher powers can act in us as we are in full waking awareness. So corresponding to the Satchitananda and its faculties are these instruments in us. Corresponding to the supermind is also a particular power and faculty in our mind as it is currently formed. That faculty or that power is not fully developed, but it is there. And he calls it the truth mind. No capitals anywhere. Truth mind. It's still mind, but the part of the mind which is familiar with or capable of holding pure truth without distortion. So the awakening of the truth mind corresponds in the mental being to the supermind and is capable of receiving the illuminations from the supermind. Unless this truth mind is activated, this transformation cannot be made complete or is not really executed. And this now becomes the crux, the focus of this working. This is going to be eventually the most important key to the transformation. There is something in us already which corresponds to that power, which mediates between the divine unity and the multiplicity below, the link point between the upper half and the lower half of the universe, the supermind. It is the creative power by which this Satchidananda deploys itself to manifest the universe. Corresponding to that power is something in our mind, the truth mind. And to the extent that this can begin to get activated, the illuminations of that can begin to work in us and transform the entire mentality and begin the process of divinizing it. The full scope of this divinization will be the theme of the yoga of self-perfection, which is in the last few chapters. But here we meet for the first time this critical principle. If it was not in us, a divine life would be impossible. Because it is in us, the divine life is inevitable. Because if it is in us as a principle, it must develop, it must come forward, and as it comes into its own, it must seize upon the whole of our nature and it must transform it in its terms. And so the question is only whether you will go through the slow evolution of 1,000,000 years, or having become conscious that it is there, develop that awareness, open to it consciously, and accelerate the evolution into a single lifetime. And so how we do that is and the importance of this is the theme of the next 2 paragraphs, which we will take up next Friday. And here we can pause, take up any comments or questions. Yes. Okay. In a very few words, Sri Aurobindo captures a wide sweep of knowledge, but also with a very practical application. If you just take the first part of how we are to work to make our body more consciously a vehicle, first as a mold of the spirit and later as a vehicle for the manifestation of the higher light and force and joy, well, the first thing we would do is to start making the body conscious. And if you ask yourself, what can you do to do that? Straight away before you there are several options. A comprehensive process of asanas would be one way to tap into all the parts of the body and make them more conscious. Holding a poise of stretch, but consciously. Awakening in that consciousness the sense of a conscious self-giving or surrender, or the sense of a communion or prayer with the divine consciousness, would be the first step to make the body a fit vehicle for the divine expression. Similarly, in our life energies, to change the way we experience life force and its relationship with the divine energy, to draw more and more upon that, to align ourselves consciously with it, to create gradually, to learn to create this alignment through which something of that can begin to flow through. The same with the sensational and emotional mentality, to step back from its automatic instinctive working in remembrance of the divine presence or in conscious perception of it in all things. One reorients our senses and our emotions. And the same with the power of the working of the intellect. Later he discusses the specific practices to learn to still the intellect so that it can open to something higher and draw it. Now, none of this is beyond our reach. All of these are existing practices in any human endeavor that seeks to exceed the norm. All the Olympic gymnasts go through these training, not necessarily with this intention for opening to a divine possibility, but the training itself is only to open to a higher capacity. The nature of the training is exactly the same. None of it is new. And if they can do it, we can do it, but with a much deeper and higher power and higher access and help equally when you align to the divine Shakti. In the training given to a gymnast today for the Olympics, almost half of the training is of the mastery of the mind and emotions. And sometimes they use physical means for it, including asanas, including meditation. But it is considered equally an important part with the physical training itself. Why? Precisely for this change, so that the knowledge will may be perfectly aligned not only in the intellect, but in the emotions and in the body. And the unifying of these three layers in a single movement. To the extent that you are able to do this, the intuitive knowledge will flow through you and the action of the gymnast is perfectly made. If you observe the gymnast, before they begin, they stand there. There's a roaring crowd, screaming, shouting, sometimes people blowing trumpets, and you see they cut off completely from that. There's a one-pointedness of the concentration. And then the thing before which is to be done. And in that perfect alignment with the thing to be done, you and the thing to be done are one. Before the body moves a single step, there is a complete oneness. And you can see that it will be perfect. If you see that there is a slight misalignment, you know that it will not be perfect. And then the body moves as the alignment leads it. Now this is possible in a gymnast with no spiritual interest. In the 1950s, a group of Russian gymnasts had visited India, and particularly they came to Pondicherry. They visited the ashram as guests of the mother, and they demonstrated some of their skills in the playground. And mother watched with great interest, and she appreciated how much they had developed in their physical consciousness in this respect. And then she commented to people around her. She said, if only they had just a little bit of spirituality, they would have been gods. So one of those who had heard this mentioned it to us. But the full value of this statement you can appreciate in recognizing that the training program that they went through is in fact a yogic program. Except it's not aiming at yoga, it's aiming at a little bit of exceeding of the human capacity. But the same program, you turn it to a divine potential and it becomes yoga.
I'm requesting you to bring some more light on the dream state.
You can do that.
Well, I'm requesting you to bring some more light on the dream state. There are some of the things which I come across is, one, we say that that normally in the dream we come across with the things which is in our subconscious, and in the waking state we are hiding it somewhere or coming across and unable to manifest, and which is manifesting in the dream state.
Right.
The point which you brings is that we are connecting with the higher states and coming back to the normal one. Another few of mine experience is that even I have come across with or I have been able to do the things which I have never dreamed of doing in my waking state, which I have done in the dream state. Or I have come across with the kind of words which I have never come across in the waking state. So as we are into the integral yoga, I come across that we have to go parallelly in the day and night as well. So will you please bring some practical tools or the techniques which we can, which help us to go into that?
Yes, eventually the goal is that the essential process of the yoga can continue into the night through the sleep state also. But all of it requires an intermixture from one into the other, from the conscious state into the semi-conscious or subconscious state of the night. So the first key we observe, things that you couldn't do in the daytime, they pop up at night. Yes?
One more thing, would like to add that where our knowledge and will goes into that time frame.
Okay. So the first thing you notice, things which were suppressed in your waking life pop up at night. That means there's a link. If you consciously suppress something, you can make it pop up at night, right? So you can use this link. Instead of suppressing now, you put an intention. Okay? So suppressing is what we do when we are unable to express something, but it's there in us strongly. So night is when it gets a free chance, when your mind is no more actively suppressing. But similarly, you can embed an intention, an aspiration. And if you do it sustained during the day, it will pop up at night. So that's your first entry point. Let's say, as an exercise, though that's not our immediate goal, you want to have a lucid dream. You want to be conscious in your dream that you're dreaming. The intention, the aspiration for it, you will start embedding during the day. So one practical exercise would be, every so many minutes, every now and then, you will stop what you do. Become intensely aware of your environment and wish yourself to be conscious that you're dreaming. Okay? So you're eating food, you stop, pause, become intensely aware of the environment and the food, and tell yourself, I'm becoming conscious that I'm dreaming. And become conscious in a heightened awareness. Now you do this again and again in the day, 10 times, 15 times. Okay, you see what you're doing? You're embedding a particular pattern of response within you. If you do this several times in the day, within a day or two, in the middle of the dream state, you will have that thing popping up. And suddenly, whatever is happening in the dream, you will become conscious, intensely aware, and you will become conscious, oh, I'm dreaming. And at that point in the dream state, you will be aware. Two things can happen. Initially, when it first happens, you'll be so excited you might end up waking up. But very likely, you'll be able to hold the dream state and awareness in dream, I'm dreaming. And the next thing you tell yourself, and you pre-program it in the day, now I will choose what to do in my dream. And you'll find you can wield reality in the dream just by intending it. You can choose to fly. So again, you might program this idea during the day. Now you see the principle. Use this now to have lucid dreams. Use this to have dreams of any particular type. Use this to find solutions to problems while in the dream. So let's say you want to go exploring flying in space. So during the daytime you will put this intention, and then you'll have dreams in which you'll be flying in space, or whatever it is that interests you, or solution to a problem. Now this principle now, if you turn it to the spiritual objective, you could choose any one of several, which is your priority. In the dream, I want to have a conscious contact with the mother. You will actually end up having that during the dream, because this aspiration takes a form where your inner being or the subtle body will presence. But it's critical for such things, you also put the intention that you will remember when you return. Otherwise, in the dream state, the thing happens, but by the time you wake up, the memory with the Satchidananda. So before sleeping, you will hold this clear aspiration that as you drift into sleep, your mind will dwell on that one goal. And you hold that intention in your mind as you drift into sleep. And the part in you which holds that intention will actually consciously carry through and more rapidly. And you'll see the difference in the quality of sleep. Or during the day, several times, you will consciously become intensely aware with the aspiration to feel, to be in the oneness of the Satchidananda. Remain immersed in that and hold that aspiration, and you let it fill your whole being down to the body even. And you do that several times in the day, and particularly before going into sleep. And you'll find all of this leans into and awakens inside the sleep state that same impulse, that same tendency and aspiration. The same thing you could turn in a different direction. You can enter with the intention to hold a part of your aware in it. If possible, go backward in your memory to recall whatever you can of the continuity of that awareness or that aspiration, as deep as you can recover. So two things will happen. On waking up, a backward movement. Before sleeping, a forward movement. And over time, now depending on people, it can take a few weeks, these two will distinctly connect. And at that time you will experience a continuity of your awareness through the night into waking. And this awareness, depending on the way you formulated the aspiration, can be simply, I am aware. I have not become unconscious. It may not remember the dreams. Or this awareness can turn to recalling specific dreams. Or when dreams are happening, this awareness may say, I don't want this dream. And it will just change the dream or reject the dream. Turn to something else. Or different things depending on your interest. But you understand the principle behind it. And so we can pause here.